Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome from myself and from Eleanor and James at the Pari Centre to the Great Rethink, this four-part seminar series with Colin Tudge. And welcome, Colin and Ruth. Welcome, Andrew Fellows, who's also going to be contributing to this morning. Some of you will remember his webinar from last July on his book on Gaia, Psyche and Deep Ecology. So it's a real pleasure to have Andrew in dialogue. Now, just a few technical things to begin with. We're recording the session. The reactions button at the bottom will enable you to put your hand up for live questions in the second half. And maybe you'd just like to open the chat button and say where you're calling in from. And then we'll get a bit of a sense of who's calling in from where, because we find it's a pretty international. Canterbury, Ireland, Norway, Switzerland, Canada, my goodness, somebody's up early. Crete, Australia, Oxford, Switzerland, Netherlands, Rotterdam, more Netherlands, Scotland, Cambridge, France. Romy Fraser, France, welcome Romy. And we'll recognize various, each of us will be recognizing various friends coming in. That's from Germany, Kildare, Ireland. Well, a very good international spread. And I don't know how many of you yet read the book by Colin, The Great Rethink, a 21st Century Renaissance. We gave it the Scientific and Medical Network Book Prize for 2020, and it happens to be published by Pari Publishing, which is the reason why we are collaborating with the Pari Centre in putting on this 2-Saturday series. So if you haven't already read the book, you should order it straight away and get stuck into it. But this will provide, I think, a very good introduction what we're doing in the next 2 Saturdays. So Colin is a biologist, and he was educated originally at Cambridge, and he's done a lot of writing and journalism during his life, and he helped set up the College for Real Farming and Food Culture, which is central to what he talks about in this book. So Colin, thank you very much for being with us. And you will let me know when you'd like me to put any slides up. I don't know whether you want those up straight away or whether you'll just tell me in due course.
Okay, do I start? I'll tell you, the slide that's called 1.0 with a picture of Andrew on it, as well as myself, that would be good.
Let me share my screen, and we'll put that share. And then we just need to play from start.
That is session 1. Now, the book and the whole thesis of my 4 sessions is one of hope. But I just want to point out that hope is not the same thing as optimism. If you look, as it were, objectively at the world's problems, you see very little scope for optimism at all. I know lots of ecologists, for example, and they all use the word catastrophe. And what we're faced with at the moment on the ecological front, beyond doubt, is a disaster. And of course, on the human front. But, so let's not be over-optimistic, but we should never give up hope. St. Paul said hope is one of the great Christian virtues. And I love Emily Dickinson's little stanza about hope, which everybody knows, but I'll say it again. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. I love that line, perches in the soul and not on the soul. So it's about hope. And the hope is, or the reason for having hope is the simple observation that if only we did conceptually simple things well, then humanity and our fellow creatures could still be looking forward to a long and glorious future. And by a long and glorious future, I'm talking about, well, the next million years for starters. And if you can do 1,000,000 years, why not 10 million and so on? We should be thinking very long term. Politicians and economists think they're thinking long term if they talk about 30 years, because they say quite rightly, you can't predict in detail what's going to happen beyond 30 years or even beyond the next 3 months, actually. But so they never think in long term, but unless we think in the very long term, I think we've more or less had our chips. The other little thing to say about that is that things that are conceptually simple, and what I'm going to talk about is all conceptually simple, can be very difficult in practice, basically because of the way human beings are, also to some extent because of the way the world is. Could I, David, have slide 1.1, the problems? As I say, no, that's not the one. That's 1.2. Anyway.
Well, this is what I've got. This is the sequence. I've got the next one after this is this one. But maybe you want the next one.
No, not that one. Anyway, look, sorry. The one I want is actually called this. It's a list of things.
Problems, right? Okay, is that a separate?
Okay, well, I'll read. It's not.
Yeah, why don't you? Because it's not on this particular sequence.
Not that vital. The point is that although I don't want to be negative, I think we do have to list the problems that we're up against, so we know what we're up against, so we know what problems we're actually trying to solve. And I've divided it into the particular problems of humanity, of which I've got 6, and problems which affect the whole world, the whole ecosystem. And of course, both affect both. I mean, anything that affects us affects everybody else because we pass on our problems to the rest of the world, and anything that affects the rest of the world affects us too. But let's just go through, first of all, the things that seem to be peculiar to humanity. The first very big question that people have been talking about for decades is, can we produce enough food? Now, the short answer to feed, for everybody. And the short answer to that is yes. Now, the world population is likely to reach, well, according to the United Nations, will probably reach a maximum of about 10 billion by the end of this century. So the question becomes, can we actually feed 10 billion people? Now, the official answer is no, or at least the official answer is not unless we go down very fancy high-tech routes, GMOs, genetic engineering, very fancy industrial chemistry, fertilizers, pesticides, and all the rest. That's the sort of heavy industrial route, which is recommended by governments like ours, by corporates, by the FAO, taken for granted by the people at the top. This is the way you should actually do things. The alternative is the one that the vegans adopt, which is to say, no, we just have to tighten our belts and learn how to live on lentils forever and ever and ever, which doesn't seem a terribly attractive proposition. Now, my point is that both of these approaches, the extreme high tech and the extreme austerity, are both very, very wide of the mark. It's quite interesting that a lot of what we're told, I'm almost inclined to say most of what we're told from on high by governments and corporates and so on, is actually wrong. And it's either wrong because the people at the top are not well informed, or because they know perfectly well what the facts are, but choose to lie. For example, Brexit was based on lies. Everybody knew that we weren't wasting 300 million a week or whatever it was, and everybody knew that if we saved that money, it wouldn't go on the NHS. Everybody knew that, and yet the Tories went round with a bus with that blazoned on the side for weeks and weeks and weeks, and nobody protested loudly enough. Anyway, the point is that much of what we're told from on high is simply deception. So the answer to the question, could we produce enough food for 10 billion, is yes. In fact, we could probably do it quite easily. And furthermore, as I'm going to be discussing this afternoon, we could do it by methods that aren't particularly outlandish and don't require us to be particularly austere. This is based partly on a statistic that comes from Hans Herren, who is the president of the Millennium Institute in Washington, who points out that the world already produces enough food for 14 billion people. In other words, roughly twice the present world population, and approximately 40% more than the United Nations says we should ever have to produce. And yet, the grand policies of the world from on high are all to do with production, production, production. The idea that we need more and more and more just to keep pace with rising population and, as they say, with so-called rising aspiration. I'll go into that more this afternoon. Now, this figure of 14 billion sounds like top of the head, sounds like pie in the sky, but actually you can confirm it for yourself just by looking up a few figures on the web, which tells us that the world now produces 2.5 billion tons of cereal per year between us. And cereal, contrary to the sort of popular belief of 40 years ago, contains not only all the energy that human beings need, but all the protein that human beings need. Now, if you take 2.5 billion tons of each ton of cereal, whether it's rice or wheat or maize or any other main ones, would sustain 3 people for a year, 1 ton, and would give them 3,000 calories a day with a commensurate amount of protein. So you could say the 2.5 billion tons of cereal that we now produce could sustain 7.5 billion people, which is roughly the present world population. But cereals provide us with only half of our macronutrient, only half our energy, only half our protein, so that the total amount is enough for about 15 billion. And that's just based on simple figures taken off the web and simple arithmetic. So we don't really need to go down the production route. We're already producing enough. The second big question for humanity is that of population. Now, in the 50s and 60s, and particularly in the 70s, population was a tremendously big issue. And everybody said, or all the people in high places said, you know, the problems of the world spring from the fact that there are too many people. This is sort of basically the same kind of idea that Thomas Malthus had at the beginning of the 19th century, and people like Norman Tebbit in Britain, Lord Norman Tebbit, still a big wheel in politics from the House of Lords. They still believe that the reason, for example, that there are now 1 billion people hungry in the world is simply that there are 1 billion too many people. That's a simplistic thinking. Now, quite rightly, this approach to population has been said to be neo-colonial, fascist, possibly eugenic, all that kind of stuff. So people hate, nowadays, thinking people hate that kind of approach, or that kind of argument. And they should hate it, because it's pretty obvious that what really matters, or what matters as much, is not the total number of people, but how much people consume per head. And I remember Paul Ehrlich pointed out in the 1970s, who was a big American ecologist, that the average American family, very self-satisfied, not more Californian family, more mom, pop, and 2 well-nourished children, probably consume about as much as an entire Bangladeshi village. And that is unquestionably the case. What really counts is total numbers versus consumption. Now, most of us who've got any sense agree that the amount that we now consume is far too great. I mean, at least that the sort of Western middle classes consume is far too great. And the aspiration to go on consuming more and more and more is ludicrous in a finite world. Actually, Pope Gregory pointed that out about 1,500 years ago. It's not a new idea, it's a sort of obvious. Anyway, so it's actually not just population. It's much more, at least as much to do with consumption. But now the pendulum has swung too far, so that if you try to bring up the question of population, you will be shouted down, told that you're a neo-colonial and a fascist and all the rest of it, as if it no longer matters, but it does matter. Total numbers matter as well as consumption matters. And the fact of the matter is that the world population has increased 4 times in my lifetime, and I'm not that old. David Attenborough said the same thing the other day, and he's about 15 years older than me. No, probably not. Yeah, at least 15 years older than me. And that's we can't go on like that. If we quadruple the present world population from, let's say, 7.5 billion, we'd be up to 30 billion by the end of the century. Well, nobody, not even the most sort of euphoric optimist, top technophile, believes that we can sustain 30 billion. So something big has got to happen in the next few years in order to start reversing the trend. Now here, there is a series of serendipities which we ought to get stuck into. And the main one is that all the measures that will actually bring population down reliably and robustly are benign. They're all the kind of things that people would like to do anyway. For example, women's liberation is a huge step forward, because one reason why so many women think they have to have 7 children is because there is no other route to prestige or kudos within their society. But if they can do other things, if they can go outside the home, etc., you find that most women actually voluntarily choose to have fewer children rather than more. So much more that in countries like Britain and Italy, and I think West Germany or Germany, the populations would now be going down quite fast, were it not for the fact that we very wisely, I might say, import people in order to maintain the sort of labor force. Anyway, so the first thing you need to do to get population down robustly is free up women so they actually have a chance to do something else. And then you need security, financial security in old age. And you need fewer children to die. If you bring down the infant mortality rate, people will have fewer children because they know, or they're pretty sure, that their children are going to live. And one reason for having 7 children rather than 2.5 is that you fear that some of them are going to die, which is a terrible, terrible thing to have to contemplate. And actually, having a lot of children with a high infant mortality is showing a sort of biological system that is out of control, basically, because human beings are designed to have few children and to make sure that they do live. We are so-called K strategists. I'll stop rambling along those lines and just point out that all the methods that could reduce the population are benign, and that if you just get the average couple having, let us say, 1.8 children rather than 2.3 children, then the population will begin to decline surprisingly rapidly. Once the replacement rate is lower than the death rate, the decline is actually quite fast. So we could start to move down easily by the end of the century, or certainly by the end of the century, if we just get the population, the birth rate down to about just under 2 children per couple. And in a few hundred years, we could get as low as we really want to get. And I'm suggesting actually that it wouldn't be a bad idea to get down to about 1 billion people, which is enough to have a huge variety of cultures. The time of Christ, huge variety of cultures, probably only 100 to 300 million people in the world. So 1 billion is easily enough to make humanity really functional. The other thing is that there are some people, sort of basically religious fundamentalists, who say, look, getting the population down is in some sense blasphemous, because each human being represents a soul, and the more souls you have, the more pleasing it is to God. I find this a very peculiar argument, but nevertheless, it is actually banded in high places, and people have written books about it. And so people of this kind say that the idea that we should get the population down to 1 billion is unhuman or anti-human. It's the very opposite. If we have a population of 10 billion people, that's 10 to the 10 people, they'd be lucky to get through the next 100 years in a tolerable state. And in fact, of course, for many people in the world already, billions, life is already intolerable, if not impossible, and it's getting worse. And of course, many of our fellow creatures are already going extinct hand over fist. So, if we have 10 billion people lasting 100 years, that's 10 to the 10 times 10 to the 2 is 10 to the 12 person years in the lifetime of the planet. If we had 1 billion people, 10 to the 9, we could have, they would easily last for another million years, if not more. That's 10 to the 6 years. So the total is 10 to the 10 times 10 to the 6, which is 10 to the 16. Unless my arithmetic has gone dramatically wrong. So if we get the population down to about 1 million, we could fit in about 10,000 times more human being or person years than if we allow it to go up to 10 and then collapse. It's not anti-human, it's very, very pro-human. But let's leave it there. Let's just say that, point out the obvious, that with a smaller population, every other problem ought to be much less. For example, the next problem I've got listed here is disease, and we don't need telling in the middle of a pandemic that disease is always still a problem. But of course, if we had a population of 1 billion, the COVID epidemic would find it much harder to sustain itself because there wouldn't be enough hosts. And also we would never have encroached as far as we have done on the wild nature. So we would never have picked up the virus in the first place. So that's another problem of humankind, disease, which is linked to population, although of course that's not the whole problem. Then there's the problem of poverty, injustice, inequality. Again, people say, well, the people in high places, like the British government, say the problem with poverty is that we don't have enough, so we have to produce more and more and more. Whereas the people who have actually looked sensibly at it say we've easily got enough. The real problem is inequality. And inequality has bad effects, not only because the people at the bottom don't have enough, but because inequality itself, meaning injustice, is itself very, very damaging psychologically. And it's a bad thing. And then there are sort of simple biological points, like the top 10% of people in the world use at least 50% of the resources, and for example, use about 50% of all the energy is absorbed by about the top 5 or 10% of people in the world. So if the top 10% were only half as rich as they are now, they'd still be filthy rich. But the rest of us, if it was spread out, could be twice as rich. I mean, it's simple, simplistic arithmetic, but it's quite striking, and I don't see what's wrong with it, really. Then there's the business of conflict, human conflict. Steven Pinker has just written a book a few years ago, which is very popular, called The Better Angels of Our Nature, an expression from Abraham Lincoln, in which he argues that violence and so on is getting less in the world, getting reduced, which is the kind of thing that people want to hear. But if you look at wars, the simple business of war, let alone other forms of violence, well, there have been something like 300 wars since World War II. There are so many that most people can't even begin to keep track of them. And it's getting worse. And of course, we have all the political refugees, as well as the climate refugees, etc. As a result, billions of people. So conflict is a disaster. Excuse me. But then I think one of the biggest disasters of all, which people don't actually draw attention to very much, is that of leadership. And if you just look objectively at the people who have most power in the world these days, the world's presidents, you find that most of them are either gangsters or idiots or both. I mean, it's easy enough to list them. I mean, we only just got rid of Trump, but he's still around. Putin is undoubtedly a gangster. I mean, Xi Jinping wipes out his own people. Genocide among people who actually live within his borders. Assad, we don't need telling that he's a gangster, and so on and so on and so on. Even when you come to a nice place like Britain, where of course we don't have gangsters and we do have idiots, but we don't have gangsters really in high places. But the present government, I would say, is dominated by mountebanks and by spids, basically. You can't run a world like that. And there's some real mysteries here. Like, how is it that even when we elect leaders, and after all, Trump was elected, we elect people who are so obviously unsuited to the task, unable to do it? I think it's a bit of a, I'm going to discuss this in a later meeting, actually, in episode 3. But even so, it's still a bit of a mystery, frankly, to me. And then, of course, the problems that affect the whole world: mass extinction, well in train, pollution, leading on to climate change. Just a word about pollution. I mean, some of the pollutants that are worst or most dangerous are sort of cryptic, like the fact that many of the industrial chemicals that escape, including a lot of plastics, contain estrogen mimics, in other words, female hormones, which reduce male fertility of all species, to the point where some people are saying in the human population that in 20, 30 years, it may be that most human pregnancies have to be sort of medical assisted because the males won't be fertile enough. I mean, you could say, well, that's a jolly good thing because it'll reduce, the population and all that sort of stuff. But that's not the way to do it, not by this kind of disastrous innovation. So pollution is huge, and plastic, of course, is one of the hugest. And of course, equally huge, or even huger, is the whole business of pollution by greenhouse gases, which is leading to climate change, which changes everything, and so on. These then are the disasters of the world. Just a few of them. Now, how are we going to get round it? Well, I said by conceptually simple things, but we've got to lay out what those conceptually simple things are. My thesis, and we've now got the diagram up on the board, which holds the whole thing together. My thesis is that if we're going to solve the world's problems, we have to rethink absolutely everything from first principles. But we must bear in mind that nothing can be solved ad hoc. So in order to solve any one problem, we have to look at all the others as well. So we have to rethink everything from first principles, but also rethink everything in the light of everything else. Quite a tall order, but not undoable, I suggest. And this is the point of our college that David mentioned earlier. Now, the task is summarized in this diagram. And as you can see, what we've got here are 12 ellipses, which I'm calling balloons, arranged in 4 tiers. And these circles around the outside indicate that all of them are supposed to feed into all the others. The top tier says the goal. And I think it's quite interesting that most governments in the modern world don't actually define what it is they're trying to achieve. I mean, they have ludicrous slogans like take control again, or America first, and so on, which sort of ring bells with people. But it doesn't sort of mean anything, when you boil it down. We should be trying to define what we're trying to achieve. And what I'm suggesting is that what we should be trying to achieve, not for me to say should, I'm just putting up an idea for others to discuss, but what we should be trying to achieve is convivial societies, but also including the idea of personal fulfillment within a flourishing biosphere. And the word biosphere is much to be preferred to the word environment. The word environment simply means surroundings. And these days, in these neoliberal days, surroundings or environment is equated with real estate. That's not the way to look at it. The word biosphere means the living world. You start thinking about the environment, so-called, as real estate, and it becomes a commodity like everything else. Start thinking about it as the living world, of which we are a part, the idea of oneness, and it becomes something sacred which must be treated with reverence, as well as with good scientific know-how. But that's what we're trying to achieve. Personal fulfillment, convivial societies, and a flourishing biosphere. All 3 things matter. Individuals matter. Society matters. I'll just divert. I know we haven't, I shouldn't, oh no, I won't. Yes, I will. I was watching the film Dr. Zhivago the other day, which is based on the novel by Boris Pasternak, and the actual screenplay was written by Robert Bolt, and it has a wonderful line in it where the Bolshevik leader says, "Society doesn't matter." And the individual doesn't matter, comrades. And one of the comrades says, what does matter, comrade? Remind me, I've forgotten. And it's a very good line, that. I don't know whether it's Bolter wrote it or Pasternak who wrote it, but it's a very good line. What matters if society doesn't, if the individual doesn't matter? Anyway, that's the top line, goal. Second tier, action. What do we need to do in order to bring about convivial societies, flourishing biosphere, achieve human fulfillment, etc., etc.? Now, all technologies are important in this respect, absolutely all of them. And technologies, it doesn't really matter whether they're low technologies, traditional technologies, horses and carts, darning needles, knitting needles, etc., or whether it's Ruth reminding me about time, but I just want to make these points, or whether it's high technologies, which means technology based on science. What matters is whether, as Schumacher said, whether the technology is appropriate. And appropriate to me means we need technologies which enable us to achieve convivial societies, flourishing biosphere, personal fulfillment, etc., etc. At the moment, technologies are not designed and marketed according to whether they make life better, really. They are designed and marketed, like everything else, according to whether they're profitable and whether they increase the power of the company or the state that's producing them. Completely the wrong approach. Of all the technologies I'm suggesting, the ones that really matter most are those of food. In other words, agriculture on the one hand and food culture on the other. I'll be talking about that this afternoon. Food culture meaning cooking, really. I shall be talking about them this afternoon. I just want to make the point that I personally coined the expression enlightened agriculture, which is agriculture that is expressly designed to provide good food for everybody in the world without injustice and without wrecking the rest of the world. That is possible, is the point, but only if we farm in very different ways from what we're doing at the moment, which I'll discuss this afternoon. Infrastructure. Must get the infrastructure right. We can't have appropriate technology or enlightened agriculture or anything else unless we have an economy which is sympathetic towards it, and unless we have a government which is sympathetic towards that economy, and unless we have appropriate laws. So what I've got under infrastructure is government, economy, and the laws of the land. Just to make the point, well, we'll be discussing all this in episode 3, but just to make the point in passing that I love the idea of economic democracy, which is an economy that is actually designed, again, to promote the causes of conviviality and personal fulfillment. And just consider that the economy we have now, that of the neoliberal economy, is actually geared simply to the maximization and concentration of wealth achieved by competing in the global market. And that's the total opposite of what we need, actually. And the last point is a matter of mindset. And all the sum total of all the ideas we have in our head, which we may or may not examine, but often don't bother to examine. They just lie in our head and we take them for granted and we act on them. But we need to re-explore and redefine the mindset. And I'm suggesting that the mindset has 4 basic components: morality, science, and then the thing that's been forgotten, but is absolutely of paramount importance, metaphysics, and finally, the arts. Let me just make a point about morality, which I'll be coming back to in session 4. People say you can't have, it's commonly said, you can't have a universal morality because morality is something that is individual to different societies have a different view of what should be done. So it's a relative thing. It depends on what people think should be the case. It depends on their culture, their tradition, their conditions, and so on. Well, excuse me. To some extent, that's true, but there is, I think, one can properly define what one might call a universal morality, which is moral ideas, moral precepts that seem to be common certainly are common to all the great religions. And if you look at all which are the sort of source of morality and practice for most societies. Now, if you ask what are the precepts that they all have in common, well, all the great religions talk about compassion. I mean, Christians talk about love the whole time, and it's basically the same idea. In the Quran, every chapter except one begins with the line, all praise to Allah, the compassionate one. Compassion, absolutely key. Second virtue, really, that all societies emphasize, all religions emphasize, is that of humility. And it's not just humility, treatment of human beings, individuals to other individuals. It's humanity as a whole have a humble approach towards the rest of nature, and a humble approach towards our knowledge. What do we actually know? What can we be certain of? What can we apply? Little humility in scientists would not go amiss. Some scientists are, of course, extremely humble, but many are that or not. And the third great principle, moral principle, which is recognized across the board, is that of having a reverential attitude towards nature. Absolutely not should it be considered as a commodity, as it is in modern Britain, for example, or in the modern West. We should feel ourselves to be part of nature, and we should feel that nature is sacred. So that's the common shared morality, I suggest. However, morality on its own won't do. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. We must, as far as possible, know what we're trying to do, know what we're doing, as far as it's possible. We can never know for certain what we're doing, whether things will turn out, but we have to do our best. And that's what science can provide us with, is some insight into how the material world actually works. And one of the sciences I think is absolutely now of key importance is the one that's largely been neglected, which is that of ecology, which becomes more and more complex the more you look at it. Very difficult science if you do it properly. But it's compounded of two different things. One is the science itself. How does the universe work? How does nature work? But also of a moral precept, which says you have to regard nature as being sacred. You have to take it very seriously. Otherwise, you can't even begin. And both these ideas, the ideas of science and the ideas of morality, are both in the end centered in metaphysics. And this is why we should reinstate metaphysics as a sort of discipline in its own right. Metaphysics at the moment does hang on, but it hangs on as the core of all the great religions. All the great religions have religion at have the same basic metaphysical ideas at the core, which I'll be discussing in section 4. Just one last point, just to show how all these issues are related. If you look at the modern economy, which is that of neoliberalism, it is based on the idea that we should and indeed must compete with each other. That if we all compete, we will drive each other to greater heights and produce more and more, and everything will improve as a result of the competition. I've spoken to a lot of neoliberals. I was loosely attached to the LSE for a time. And there was a very strong argument that then, early 20th century, less strong these days, that this idea of competition has got deep biological roots. It is supposed to be sort of Darwinian. And Darwin is supposed to have told us that natural selection works by everything competing with everybody else, and that the weakest go to the wall and all that kind of thing. Well, Darwin was actually a very good zoologist, a very good biologist, and he knew perfectly well that he said, that actually it's in animals and plants, living things do compete, but actually they also cooperate. And if you look at nature as a whole, I would suggest that nature as a whole is more cooperative than it is competitive. I would say that competitiveness is a fact of life, inescapable, but actually cooperation is the essence of life. Life is innately a cooperative. You look at the eukaryotic cell, the kind of cells that we have, body cells that we have, they are cooperatives between different kinds of microbes and so on. If you look at ecosystems that actually work, they are in balance because everything, although everything's sort of competing, they're also cooperating to create a greater whole. So actually, if we wanted, can I go back to the my?
Yeah, you're on 40 minutes now, Colin. Just to let you know.
This is my last.
Because I thought you needed the other slides.
No, I have to forget those. As you say, flexibility. You're going to have to drop them. Doesn't matter. Not the end of the world. But I just want to say that, yes, sorry, the idea that the neoliberal economy based on ecology is based on good biology is actually wrong. And the idea that it's Darwinian, or as they like to say these days, neo-Darwinian, is therefore wrong. The idea that everything should be based on competition is in fact meta-Darwinian, meaning beyond Darwin, and it doesn't actually have anything to do with biology at all. Even if the modern economy and the modern morality was based in biology, that doesn't make it right, because as I think most of us would accept, although what is right, what is natural does have a bearing on what we consider to be right, you can't just say that what is natural is therefore right. The whole point of morality is to transcend what comes naturally. I think I'm going to leave it there and we can have a discussion, but that is the essence, that is the sort of essence of of my thesis, which we'll be discussing in the next 3 sessions, which is discussed further in the book and is the basic premise of our college. Shall I leave it there, David, or shall we go?
Yes, no, I think let's bring in Andrew at this point, and then see what he has to say in response. Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. The first thing I want to say, funnily enough, is about timing. And it's the timing of the release of this book, because I think we're at an absolutely pivotal point in our history and the timing is really crucial. Are we going to, after this pandemic, return to the old normal or some kind of new normal? And it brings to mind David Peate's notion of gentle action, that if we make a perturbation to a massive system at the right moment, it can have disproportionately important and significant consequences. I like Colin's emphasis on hope. Somehow hope just fizzes throughout the entire book. And I like his argument that basically people are good and can be trusted without naively denying the existence of evil. But I think it's important, I'm sure there's all sorts of behavioral psychology will bear this out, that if you trust people, they tend to behave better. So I think it's a self-reinforcing phenomenon. Somebody put in the chat box how much they like the word conviviality. I love it. I think it's really, really important in this context. And right at the end of the book, Colin mentions the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And he said that in 2020, the last time they could meet in reality rather than on another computer screen, they had over 1,000 engaged farmers and other people who met, and I quote, in the town hall, in a church, in a conference centre, and in a pub. And I thought that is marvellous. That in a very down-to-earth way brings together all the elements of his book and is a wonderful example of conviviality. So I think Colin clearly walks the talk. You know, as the alchemists say, the microcosm is the macrocosm. So I think it's really important to ground this action, and I think he does that. When I compare what I wrote in my book and what he's written in his, I think the most common factor is simply our insistence on what the British civil service likes to call joined up thinking. In other words, what we've done is joined the dots, and the sort of underlying philosophy of that, if you like, is holistics, a holistic worldview and a systems worldview, which, as Colin knows much more about ecology than I do, is absolutely central to that aspect of the life sciences. We've come at the problem or the whole question from opposite directions, in that Colin has started off by stating his goal, and his book goes through all the actions and so on, the practical requirements, and ends with metaphysics. I do it in the opposite direction. Somebody said to me, Andrew, why don't you write a more accessible version of your book? Well, in a way, I think that's what Colin has done. So I think in many ways we need both, though. What I've included and he hasn't are Jungian psychology and deep ecology. It doesn't matter, because I'm astonished reading his book how much similar ground we cover. You could almost say that all roads lead to Rome, but I think a more helpful thing to bear in mind is what Alfred Korzybski said in Science and Sanity in 1930, the map is not the territory. So Colin and I are both employing different maps to reach the same territory. It also helps us through some of the puzzles of metaphysics. Concerning the goal, I want to just share one slide if I can. Let's try. Can you all see that?
Yeah, excellent.
Okay, so what I've done is I've taken Colin's stated goal in his book, which is now obscured by part of the menu, but as I remember, it says convivial societies with personal fulfillment in a flourishing biosphere. And this is just to illustrate how thinking is converging on this. This is from Kate Raworth's book, which he does mention in his book. Colin mentions in his book, Donut Economics. And I've put it here because it illustrates graphically the two pillars of Colin's argument, which is morality and ecology. So the outer limit of this donut, if you like, is determined by ecology. These are the planetary boundaries determined by state-of-the-art Earth system science. And what the inner boundary of this is based on the I'm just looking up in my own book, it's based on the United Nations Development Goals, and it is all about equality, justice, and so on. And none of that will arise without the morality that Colin talks about. So in a way, what Colin is writing about, what this picture shows is where we want to be, and it is absolutely commensurate with Colin's goal. And what Colin's book is all about is how to get there. Okay, so I'll stop sharing the screen now, but I think it's so important, just to, like Colin's diagram, which he very kindly lent to me before his book was published, that I could sneak into my lecture last year. I think it's really important. A picture really is worth 1,000 words. Colin said, all human action should be guided by moral and metaphysical principles on the one hand, and by the principle of ecology on the other. So I'm going to stop sharing that. So what we've got, the bedrock's ecology, which is driven by science, and morality. And Colin goes, I suppose you could lump it together under perennial wisdom and spirituality. And something that interests me, interests the scientific and medical network, interests the Paris Centre, is the way these two apparently disconnected fields are beginning to converge. That all started with some of the thorny issues raised by quantum physics at the beginning of the last century, where consciousness appeared to play a role in scientific observation. You could not leave the observer out of the picture. It's really gaining momentum now with more general approaches to the whole mystery of mind and matter, and in particular, the science of consciousness. David Lorimer and I met at the Science of Consciousness conference in Interlaken 2 years ago. There were, I think, 600 people there. And there's a real consensus emerging that is really going to bring these two fields together. The stickiest bit in Colin's book when I read it was politics. It is just such an obstacle. And just to emphasize what Colin has been saying, Steve Taylor, who is well known to the scientific and medical network, incidentally just published a book called Science and Spirituality, which is absolutely about bringing them together, recently published an online article in The Conversation, and it was called How to Stop Psychopaths and Narcissists from Winning Positions of Power. His proposed solution was to screen would-be politicians by using the services of psychologists. There used to be a BBC broadcast called radio broadcast, I think called In the Psychiatrist's Chair.
Yes.
And I do think that all would-be politicians should be put through that. But I also feel to an extent it's just kicking the can down the road. If you do that, the psychologists become the kingmakers. The psychologists get into the position of power. And I just want to throw in a quote from Jung, the only one today, I promise you, and it's not exactly a quote, it's from memory, but Jung said, where there is the will to power, there is no love. And where there is love, there is no will to power. In other words, it's the will to power, not hate, that is the opposite of love. And how do we reconfigure the notion of power, the whole ethos, if you like, behind the political process? Colin isn't naive. He talks about utopia very near the end of his book, but he says this isn't about perfection at all. Jungians would agree with that. The whole purpose of individuation in the Jungian sense isn't to strive for perfection, it's to achieve wholeness, which brings us back to this kind of holistic systems view of the world. There's a wonderful, I don't know if Shantana Sabadini, the sort of academic director of Parry, is online today or not, but I quote this at every opportunity from the foreword he wrote to the I Ching Oracle, where he said, it is on the edge between order and chaos that the subtle dance of life takes place. Here the real complexity arises. Here forms bend and loop and transmute and evolve. That has nothing to do with perfection. It's all about dynamism. So to wrap up, I have no idea how long I'm taking because I didn't plan reading this out beforehand, but as we said, we'd go with the flow. I think that something really important that deep ecology can bring is this concept of identification with the biosphere. In other words, it's a psychological approach to being with nature, not explicitly a moralistic approach. If we identify with the biosphere, then we realize that by serving the biosphere, we are serving ourselves. The two are not separated to any extent whatsoever. And I think if one can really take that on board, not as an intellectual concept, but live it for long enough, you can arrive at well, something Krishnamurti actually called choiceless awareness, which I think is a wonderful expression, that it is not a burden to live in harmony with nature. It just comes naturally, if you'll excuse the pun. And integral to all that are the three things that he really stressed towards the end of the book, where in metaphysics, humility, compassion, and reverence for nature, and ultimately re-enchanting the world, if you like. So I think that's all I have to say. No idea how long that took, but is that a helpful contribution?
Yeah, really excellent, Andrew, because I think, as you both said, we need to bring in a number of dimensions to the discussion. We think it might just be about economics, but actually it's not. It's about ecology, it's about sociology, it's about philosophy, it's about science, it's about the arts, it's about metaphysics, and all these things are connected. And so the systemic view, both sort of vertically and horizontally in a circle, is just essential for And this is what really, I think, should be embedded in our educational systems, which it isn't. We're actually reproducing the mentalities that are creating the problems that we are talking about today. So what I'd like to do, I would like to, I think, go into breakout rooms for 10 minutes or so, just to give people a chance to exchange in smaller groups. Then we're going to have a break, and then we'll come back for Q&A. But before that, both of you, Colin and Andrew, do you have a key question that you'd like, you'd suggest or propose for people to consider?
Well, my question I've written down here is, do you consider this whole approach, like my slide, which said this is what we should be thinking about and how we go? Do you think that's a sensible approach? Is my basic question.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, and then we'll put some comments in the chat and some questions that will arise from that in the second half. So,
David, could I suggest another question as well?
Absolutely.
Which is, how can we go beyond singing to the choir? I'm extremely conscious that it's the same group of people talking to each other all the time. How do we do it without creating an ideology, a dogma, a movement? It's really a juggling act.
Absolutely. It's juggling the spirit and the letter, the spirit and the law. And it's very easy for us to think we've got all the right ideas. Great, thank you very much. So, Eleanor, why don't you put us into some groups? If you don't want to join the group, you don't have to. And then at 12:10, we will have a 5-minute break. So what we will do, we can take some questions from the chat, but we can also, you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question directly to either of the speakers. And what about, anybody like to feed back at all from the small groups, either in the chat or to say something that struck them? Answer is yes. Let's see who's got their hand up. Diane. Yes. Sorry, I haven't got my... Right, okay, that's a bit better. Diane, you'd like to make a point?
Yes, our conversation in the chat was brilliant in that, in fact, I even wrote it down, morality. We had a conversation that there are two things, at the moment when people talk to each other, there are two areas that they say, be very careful. It's politics and religion, those two things. And those two things, both of which are really important in that politics is mostly about the law. They make things legal. So at the moment, the lobbying situation, they're all saying, oh, we didn't break the law, everything's above the law, blah, blah, blah. But they had no morals. There was no morals. And there's a thing with religion that morality is doing what is right regardless of what you're told. Religion is doing what you're told regardless of what is right, which is a very thing to say, but there you go. But those two things, it's morality that comes into it. And when we, in our discussion, we actually, I didn't write it down in the end. Compassion with heart. Morality is, compassion is morality with heart. There we go, yeah.
Thank you, thank you. So that was sounded like a good exchange.
It was a great conversation.
Claire, you're next. Or whoever is in, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, David. Brilliant talk, Colin. I've been on this bandwagon for, oh God, almost 50 years, really, of ecology. I remember it being introduced at university when I was reading geography at UCL. Big subject, and been trying to bang on. Today, the biggest problem I find is that people are complacent. Oh, it's all right. Oh, well, you're talking about if I raise any issues, oh, well, it's okay, you know, the weather varies. Yeah, well, it's such a big issue. Even if I save my petrol, even if I don't drive, it doesn't make any difference. And then, oh, well, we'll vote for Boris. Yeah, he's done quite a good job. It's just complacency.
I think you're right, because if you look at the surveys, you'll find that about 5% of people will be active in terms of activism in whatever field one's talking about. Now, the 8% will do one thing, and so that makes 13%, which means 90% do nothing. And I agree with you. So I think there's complacency, and I think it's also part of our wiring that we're wired for emergencies, and which is why we're so exercised about COVID, because it's an emergency. But a longer emergency is less easy to get to grips with. Sorry, I should be passing this over to you, and Colin.
Well, there's also the tragedy of the commons, David. The tragedy of the commons.
Yes.
I think you know.
Garrett Hardin. Yeah, absolutely. Andrew and Colin, do you have an observation on this complacency, how one gets around complacency?
Well, just back on the... Oh, sorry.
Yes, no, carry on.
On the theme of hope, that I agree, so much complacency, etc. I talk at length in the book about the need for democracy, everyone take part. But of course, complacency is the absolute opposite of democracy. Democracy requires us to take an interest and be informed and all those things. But on the positive side, what we need to change the world round is a critical mass. And a critical mass is not necessarily or usually a majority. If you have 20% of people on side, that's enough to make the whole lot come along, precisely because most people actually are indifferent or complacent or not taking part. And if as few as 5% of the whole can shove the whole thing around if they get their acts together. So I agree, complacency terrible, but doesn't take many to make change.
Well, there's another analogy one could use, Colin, which is that of the early, middle, and late adopters. And so you could say that we are early adopters of these ideas. Then you've got the sort of people who come next. But the majority of people, you have to get to, as you say, a tipping point before everybody will think, well, that's obvious, we should be doing that.
Mm.
Could I chip in with a quote from John Cleese that is relevant in this context, in a wonderful old film called Clockwise?
Oh,
It
yeah.
turns out he's absolutely at the end of his tether. Everything has gone wrong. And at one point, in sheer exasperation, he says, "It's not the despair I can't stand, it's the hope." And I've actually used this in quite a lot of therapeutic sessions with my own analysans, because despair doesn't require energy and hope does. And that's why I said there was so much energy fizzing in Colin's book. We need to keep hold of that energy as well.
Very good.
Yes, I mean, in the sense that we're talking about a grassroots here, then maybe what it's obvious that we need a lot of collaboration with other organizations. And we are doing that with Vandana Shiva, which I'll mention at the end of this morning. But it's actually these convivial local groups of people talking and then maybe uploading the results of their conversations into some more central area. I mean, I don't know whether we could facilitate some of that, but it's because it's one of the ways that things change is by people talking about them. And so supposing everybody who's on this seminar talks to another half a dozen people about the seminar, well, that's 340 already. No, 420, 76 of them. And so there is a kind of viral effect here. And I think there is a resonance now that people are beginning to get the message that things have to change quite radically. And so I would argue that people are more receptive probably now than they were before COVID, for instance.
Can I just make another point?
Sure.
That, one of the key points of my book, which I failed to mention in my talk this morning, is the whole idea of Renaissance. that if you rethink everything and you rethink everything in the light of everything else and act accordingly, that is in effect a renaissance, which I suggest is more far-reaching and more fundamental than the European Renaissance of, let's say, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, and requires more radical change. However, whereas the earlier European Renaissance was led by intellectuals and by the some, no, not, well, let's say by intellectuals and by bankers. I mean, the Medicis were bankers. The Renaissance we need now must be led by people at large, because the people who are now commanding the world, and basically an oligarchy of big governments, corporates, financiers, intellectuals, have an interest in the status quo. They want the status quo. They basically think the status quo is okay and it just needs a bit of tweaking. Exactly. But it needs radical rechange. So the Renaissance we need now has to be led by us, people at large. And what you were just saying, David, that what we require is the collaboration of lots of different groups that are apparently doing different things, but actually are pulling on the same rope. That is key, I think.
Well, we'll organise an event with Humanity Rising. They've got about 400 partners in organisations, and they're doing something nearly every day from 5 to 7 CET. So I'll get you and Andrew together with a couple of other people, and we'll get the conversation going in that forum as well.
Very good.
Who else would like to come in? Andrew, do you want to say anything more at this point?
No, are there no questions from other people?
No, I'm just waiting for people to put their hands up or to put something in the chat, because there's a lot to talk about. What about any other people? Yes, we have Diane coming back again, but does anybody else want to report on their breakout room? So Diane, you had another point you like to make.
Wendy?
Only one sentence, and very briefly. Yesterday on Humanity Rising, in the after chat, there was a book mentioned, and it was, oh, this is the best book ever, The Secret Life of Trees. And having looked up The Secret Life of Trees, who wrote it? Colin Tudge. Okay, I'll close
okay. There was someone, Livia and Tom, did you want to speak? I saw a sort of hand gesture coming up. You need to unmute yourselves.
We wanted to just point out that Wendy Cook has been raising her hand. She doesn't do it with the Zoom, but by real hand.
Ah, okay. Wendy, do unmute yourself and make your point.
I've been Wendy, get back to me, Claire.
Are you there? Wendy? Yeah, good.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Well, maybe it's not the right moment, but I'm just wondering what our participants and teachers think about Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset, which seems to be very surreptitiously, but very, very definitely being rolled out without due checking. Do you know what I mean, Klaus Schwab?
Absolutely, I know what you mean. I've been following this quite closely. I have his book over there, which I haven't yet had time to read, because I wanted to read it from the horse's mouth. But my general view, and other people may have a different view, is that this is technocracy being rolled out, and that a lot of what is passing for the Great Reset in environmental terms is actually about smart cities and the fourth industrial revolution, the Internet of Things, and just the kind of issues that Colin is warning about. So I agree with Colin that we need a great rethink rather than a great reset. I could say a lot more, but I'll allow others to come in, and then we'll go to Janice and Manfred. Great Reset, Colin.
Haven't read it, don't know it.
Well, this is Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, and of course it's basically a billionaires' agenda, because that's where all the billionaires and the politicians meet. It's Davos, which we were talking about before, so this is really the 1%, and as there's this new book by Vandana Shiva, which you should all read, called Oneness versus the 1%. And so what we don't need is a continuation of business as usual, or a tweaking of business as usual. We need the kind of radical transformation that you're talking about in your book. You probably have a view as well, Andrew.
Can I just say something before, Andrew? I was actually invited to Davos about 10, 15 years ago, actually to speak, and I gave 3 talks. And basically, there were some wonderful people there, including Yehudi Menuhin, but it was a dreadfully depressing experience. It really was. I mean, it's not exactly a novel observation, but yeah, so that's it. I mean, it was just, as you say, billionaires telling us how we should run the world and according to their lights.
Well, that's that. I really admired Greta Thunberg when she stayed in a tent rather than a hotel when she spoke there in 2020, I think, just early 2020, and when everybody else was in a heated hotel, she was in minus 15 or whatever in a tent, making her point. Andrew, have you anything to add to that?
Well, I'm not familiar with Great Reset either. Resetting is what you do to computers, though, whereas humans actually.
Absolutely. And well, we did have an article about it, quite a hard-hitting article in the last issue by Rob Verkerk. So do have a look at that, because there's a lot of singing from the same hymn sheet for the world leaders. It
does. I mean, it does sound to me rather closely related to the whole worldview of eco-modernism, which I hadn't heard of until I read Clive Hamilton's excellent book, Defiant Earth. And eco-modernists actually believe that the Anthropocene and all that's going on at the moment is a monument to humanity's success. It is a good Anthropocene. And with the continued application of technology, geoengineering, spraying sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to turn the sky white, putting mirrors in orbit to reflect the sun, nuclear power everywhere, industrial farming, everything that Colin and I are horrified by, will solve everything. That isn't a reset. That is just business as usual. It's just taking our hubris to an absolute extreme.
Well, and also the idea that a technical fix can solve our problems, as it were. And this is the, no, I think we agree, this is the wrong model, wrong approach. Exactly. Thanks so much. Janice, what would you like to contribute?
Well, I'd like to contribute from our breakout group. We took the question, how do we reach beyond the choir, and went in about 3 directions. One was that we really have to shift from just exchanging ideas among the choir to actually action and expressing things in a way that the middle adopters, if we use that expression, can understand. And if we could come together to really co-create a new version of the new story, i.e. the old story in a new form for today, based on the interconnectedness and love of the planet and each other. This could be, if we had the money to distribute it really widely, along with local groups encouraged to discuss these sorts of things, along with education being much more interdisciplinary. I was part of the first 30 years of the Open University, and we pioneered really interdisciplinary teaching at that level, and that is not what students are getting in university today or even in school. It's all being compartmentalized and put into specialisms. We need to open things up to look at the wholeness of everything and get together and actually start to act. So I'm wondering if the network could, perhaps with your wonderful new website, help bring small groups together to work on different aspects of that. Thank you.
Yes, no, I think that's an interesting idea. Of course, what individuals and groups like us do is just what we can in terms of our circle of influence. But I think we need to remember that we're part of a much bigger worldwide movement, and there's an awful lot going on. It's the Blessed Unrest, if you remember that book, where if you're not encouraged and despairing at the same time, he said, then you actually haven't understood what's going on. And so that each of us, as you say, has a responsibility for what we can do in our circle of influence. And in terms of clarifying things and discussing, I think the other thing we can do actually is to support organizations that are doing the work that we think needs to happen.
Yes.
So I do that as well. I support various organizations and I support campaigns. And so that's all a part of it. So it's that there are multiple avenues that we need to be pursuing, but obviously it's a matter of priorities and time.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And would either of you like to comment on what Janice has said, Colin and Andrew? Otherwise, we'll go on to Manfred, who's speaking from where, Manfred?
I'm speaking from southwest of Germany.
Great.
Do you understand me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I brought in the breakup group was that I questioned if morality is really the way to change, what's the way of change. And what we discussed, I think it depends on what morality means, because if it means something made out of thought only, then I doubt it. If it is something which is behind thought, what we call spirituality, I think that is a complete different way to change. And the strongest block, even in myself, is fear. And I was asked, how do we address fear? And quite frankly, I don't know. What I'm doing is, when fear comes up in myself, I stay with it. But that is a concept for me. And I'm not sure it's a concept for people who never have any connection to something behind thought.
I think that's a very important point, Manfred. Thank you. I think if it's just thinking about things, then that isn't going to change, although there is a thinking aspect. But what energizes people is emotion and feeling. It's when you feel strongly about something that you take action. And this is a function of the right hemisphere of the brain, not the left, which is all about analysis. And I think we've learned a huge amount about fear and manipulation over the last year. And this applies to all countries, and where it's also, as everybody knows, it's the stock in trade of authoritarian approaches to control people, and that's using the mechanistic idea that people are machines that need to be controlled. And it seems to me that the nudge unit, the behavioral unit of the UK government has really got out of control, because they've been using known psychological manipulation techniques, to get the public health message out. And it's very damaging and is really in danger of wiping out our fundamental rights. And I think the antidote to fear for me is love with a capital L, but also courage. And all the great people who stood up for things, Mandela and Gandhi and people, they say it wasn't that I wasn't afraid. They said I overcame that, and I used the power of truth, which is the satyagraha. So I think we need to take heart, if I can put it that way. Encourager is related to cœur, which is taking heart. And we can take heart also from each other. The very fact that we are here talking about these important things today, rather than doing something else, is a sign of encouragement. So thank you so much for that. I don't know whether either of you got anything to add. Otherwise, we'll go on to Eve, who has the next question.
It wasn't so much a question as a response, David, and you stole my thunder rather. Oh.
No, carry on.
Were talking to me?
Yep. Yeah. Carry on.
Yeah. But just, you know, I was going to say very similar things. But I'd just like to add an image in terms of love and fear, which is that if your child or even your dog, you know, is being swept away by the river, fear doesn't come into it. You just act because you do, and I also feel, I suppose, I mean, love is never going to be given a seat at the table of power except as a token, like Greta Thunberg. But it has a subtle effect. And I think the more we try to bring that into our lives and into our contact with other groups, the more it does get constellated in the collective.
Yes, thank you. I think this also reminds me, I was in India in 2006 for a meeting in February, just after the Davos meeting had taken place. And one of the people in the International Futures Forum had actually been there. And what they did before their speech, because they were talking about India, that they had some Indian dancers. And so they changed the mood of people by having dancers introducing what they had to say. And I said, that's fantastic, but you know what? It'd be much better if you actually able to get the delegates up on the floor and get them dancing themselves. Then they'd really feel a sense of togetherness after they'd overcome the embarrassment. So Eve, thank you so much for that. And we're going next to Lloyd and Jeremy.
Yes, a couple of comments. One is on morality. I really liked what Francisco Varela had to say about ethics, which is that ethics isn't an intellectual apprehension of things. Ethics is an embodied knowing of what is right. And then as far as what is necessary, I think community is something that doesn't get talked about enough. In the United States, what I consider our most successful social movement was Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights, leadership of the civil rights movement. And that was premised upon the beloved community. And King was not a protester. The people with him were being the manifestation of the beloved community wherever they were. And neoliberal capitalism has so atomized our societies that the very idea of community is foreign to us now. And that's one of the things we have to figure out. How do we begin to come together again?
Totally. I think that's incredibly important. And this is really the agenda of the World Social Forum as opposed to the World Economic Forum. You know, another world is possible is the slogan of that movement. And it's based on small scale. And I think this is what where, you know, if Satish Kumar was here, he would say what we need is people coming together locally and grassroots, as Colin has been emphasizing. And I love that embodied knowing of what is right. I've just written that down. That's fantastic, Lloyd. Andrew and Colin, would you like to respond to what Lloyd has said?
I did, but I've got out of my head. One obvious thought in passing. If you put neoliberalism with all that it implies, including atomization of society, together with sort of uncritical technophilia, as you said, the idea that everything can be fixed by technology, put those two together and you have the most toxic cocktail you could possibly imagine. That's the way to kill the world. And these are the two prevailing ideas a neoliberal economy, absolute faith in technology and in the kind of science that supports that technology. Disaster. That's not very helpful.
No, I agree with that, and that's where the power is.
Yeah.
And this is one of the crucial issues is how to modulate that, especially. I mean, I think part of the answer is decentralization, whereas our current systems are going towards increased centralization, which is also concentration of power. And the technologies are now enabling this technocracy, and China is already a technocracy, and the degree of surveillance and control and compliance there is really extraordinary and worrying.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the reasons, of course, the prime reason why neoliberalism and technophilia dominate and in partnership is that they do lead to concentration of power. So it's a tautology.
Yes, in other words, the system, that's the dynamic of the system, is to lead to more. And if you look at the billionaires, they increased their wealth by sort of 30% during 2020. Jeremy, you've had your hand up for a while. What would you like to say? Do unmute yourself.
Hi. I want to recommend a little book by an American called Joel Barker.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, I've got a very old computer, I'm afraid.
Okay, right.
I want to recommend a little book by an American called Joel Barker, which is called Paradigms, The Business of Discovering the Future. And he coins a couple of it's a hopeful book, and he coins a couple of useful terms to represent this sort of problem. And he talks about paradigm paralysis and paradigm pioneers, which would be us, I hope.
Yeah.
And it's hopeful because he gives many examples of the way that paradigm paralysis has been overcome. I'll just quote three. For example, sensible and responsible women do not want to vote. Grover Cleveland, 1905. There is no likelihood that man can ever tap the power of the atom. Robert Millikan, Nobel Prize winner in physics in 1920. And there is no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. A quotation from the president of Digital Equipment Corporation in 1977. So there is every possibility that persevering in the manner in which many people have been speaking can achieve a great deal.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Could you put the name and title of the book in the chat for everybody?
Yeah, I will.
That would be great. That's very useful. So, Christina, you've been waiting to speak for a while.
Yeah, I just wanted to refer back to what Manfred said when he brought up the question of fear. And it seems to me that one reason why it's so easy to instill fear these days is that any kind of suffering, be it suffering of the ego or suffering of the body, and then death in particular, are just all seen as avoidable outrages. You know, they're just outrageous things. It's an outrage that these things should continue to exist. And that if governments were doing their job properly, none of these things would happen anymore. And I think there's a lot of our ills could be sort of removed if people change their attitude to suffering and to death and our mortality.
Well, I think this is also part of the transhumanist agenda, isn't it? To overcome death, overcome the body. Our biology is flawed, so we need to enhance ourselves. And I'm going to be one of the great unenhanced. I'm not going to enhance anything. And if I'm marginalized as a result, I really don't care. Thank you very much for that. That's sort of a metaphysics area, Colin, isn't it? this change of attitude to death and life.
Sure, yeah.
James, you had your hand up, then you put it down again. Is there something you'd like to say, James?
Yeah, sorry, no, I was raising my hand on behalf of someone else that couldn't raise their hand, but in the end there was no question, so it's all good. Okay, good. So let's just see if there's anything else coming in the chat. Yes, Linda Carroll, ethics is not an abstract idea. It evolves ideally from the inner sense of love and compassion and understanding of oppression. And I think there's, I mean, for me, my take on this is it starts from the metaphysics, and that there is a level at which we are all one being. And if we really understood this, which is also put forward by the Bulgarian sage Peter Dunov, then we would realize that we're all part of a whole, and that the way that we fulfill ourselves is to serve the whole. It sounds like a corny message, but these things, the great things are actually quite simple. Robert, nice to see you. What would you like to contribute?
Hi. Yeah, it's just a point that came up in our group about politics. I think Andrew mentioned the fact that politics is a sticky one. And somebody in our group was saying that actually politics is vastly overrated in terms of what it can achieve. But for me, it does raise a question, because we do talk a lot about democracy. I'm just trying to make, what I'm saying here is actually really just a question, is how do we really experience ourselves as individuals? My feeling is that the whole idea of being an individual is undergoing a radical shift. I think Christina mentioned suffering and death. We are learning so much about trauma, for example, now, especially in the last couple of years. A lot of discussion around, racism, systemic racism, whatever we may think about that. But it's a very interesting field of inquiry, because we see so many levels of our personal experience as human beings being sort of revealed to us or opened up to us. And it seems to me that one of our questions might be around how we are developing as conscious individuals and what that actually means. Because I think, I love the reference to hope, by the way. If I see you as a source of potential, so, I have a hopeful view of you, I'm much less likely to cancel you out. And I think this is a major question that's coming up here for me, and I think it is a profoundly political question, because if at the moment our systems are so mechanized that they are able to commodify the human being, it's because we don't really know ourselves as human beings.
I couldn't agree more, and I think this self-knowledge, deep self-knowledge, and the transcendent model of the human being needs to be reasserted alongside what Colin has been saying, which is the earth is also sacred. Colin, do you want to comment on that? We've got two more people who'd like to speak, and I think that will have to be it, except Girma also apparently wants to raise their hand, so let's take three.
There's only 5 minutes left, so shall we take those questions?
Let's do that, yeah. So Ferdinand. Need to unmute.
Yes, someone in our group mentioned how do you deal with somebody like Putin? And I think that the way to deal with that is to, I conceive of Putin and people like Xi Jinping and Trump as operating from a level of not malice, but fear. A deep-seated fear. So I think that the common mindset is to see people as autonomous agents, and this power, this belief in free will, and this autonomy means that these people operate on on a level of malice. And I think that's a fallacy that we need to overcome.
Yeah, thank you. That's a thoughtful observation. And of course, fear goes with control. The more afraid you are, the more you want to control things. And I think this is probably this may well be the case. But it's also part, as Colin's been saying, of this technophilia, this idea that we are really just machines to be manipulated and controlled. Petra, and then Guillermo can come the final comment. Thank you.
Thank you, David. In response to Robert's question on individuals, I'd also like to quote the British comedy group Monty Python with inspiration from Colin and others. And the film Life of Brian, when he's proclaiming as the so-called Messiah, you must all be individuals. And the crowd says, we are all individuals. And one fellow pipes up, I'm not.
Brilliant. No, I think you're right. I think humor actually is really essential. No, Voltaire used it very effectively in the 18th century with Candide, humor and irony, and various other of his short stories. So maybe this is something we need to major on, or produce a play. A play is another way of doing things. But John Cleese, as you may know, is very interested in all of these issues, and is a close friend of Ian McGilchrist. And you can actually have a look on the YouTube. You can find some hilarious conversations between Ian and John Cleese about humor in the right hemisphere. So Guillermo, your final word here before we get the sort of concluding observations from Colin and Andrew. So would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, so can you hear me clearly?
Yes, absolutely. Look, you're outside. Terrific.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had this question, basically, how are we going to do this? So grassroots was mentioned, but I'm still, yeah, I don't know if grassroots will cut it. As the person before me already said it, a lot of the leadership and a lot of economic and political leadership is probably acting out of fear / trauma. And if I hear us speaking now, then I have a lot of hope for the future, for our children, for my children, for my children's children, how we can make sure that doesn't happen, so that people will that their traumas are influencing their behavior as much as it's doing now. But how are we going to do this in the short term for people in political leadership, shaping systems like media, education, etc.?
Well, it's really the $64,000 question, and I think it's something that we can only answer for ourselves and our sphere of influence, and other people. We need a lot of people to join in, and I think let's just take education, for instance. That I work in education with a project called Inspiring Purpose, and that's what I'm trying to help young people do. And we have a program at the moment called Sustainable Futures, and we've got 85 schools involved in that. So that's probably about 10,000 young people, and so that's an example of something. So I think we need to be very creative, and do read and talk about Colin's book, because that's a starting point. And maybe we'll have further ideas along the road, because this is only session 1 of 4 sessions. So thank you so much for your contributions, and let's see if there's any concluding observations or interim concluding observations that Colin and Andrew, his guest, would like to make before we sign off.
I'd just like to stress the idea of conviviality, because the idea has got around, and it's come up in this little discussion, that human beings are not basically convivial, that we are mistrustful of each other, etc., etc., all of which is true. But and that this is the sort of biological state because we're all bound to compete. And I think it's crucial to acknowledge that that is not the sort of ground state of humanity. It's not how we are, really. And most people are perfectly capable of conviviality, which involves generosity and compassion and all the other things. And for most people, this is the preferred state. So to me, for most people, so to me, the state that we ought to be moving towards, i.e. conviviality, is what ought to come naturally to most of us. And somehow or other, we've allowed ourselves to be talked out of it by intellectuals and pushed out of it by people who are interested in power, etc. But this power craziness, which we admire, and the desire for wealth, the billionaire and all that kind of thing, this should be seen actually as pathology. It's pathology in the sense that it's very much a minority, and also in the sense, so it's anomalous, and also in the sense that it's so damaging. And the idea that we should be led by what is essentially a pathology is kind of ludicrous when you think about it.
Yeah,
what we need
I
to
agree. I think that this conviviality is a hugely important notion. So let's talk about conviviality and work out how we can be convivial. Also with just in our immediate surroundings, with our neighbours. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to finish with?
Yes, two thoughts. One in response to the last question about the $64,000 question, how? I spent a lot of time at the beginning of my book dismissing either or thinking. I want to promote both and thinking. And it came out, David, you remember I wrote a puff piece about my book called From Applied Physics to Applied Metaphysics.
Yes.
In my life, I've had the same goal in mind consistently. I've been on demonstrations, protests, direct action. I've worked as an engineer on wind energy. I've lobbied at governmental civil service department level. I became a Jungian analyst and got into metaphysics. We've got to pursue all of these fronts at the same time because this is an emergency. We have not a minute to lose. And each of us simply has to do what we best can within our abilities. I can't run a thing like Colin's real farming conference because I live in a country where I don't speak the main language well enough, okay? But my circumstances, so we all have our own unique circumstances. And then the second comment, I keep coming back to this question of morality because I think it's such a slippery subject. And an awful lot of wars in the world have been fought in the name of morality, and I'm quite careful about it. And so I just want to stress, at the risk of repeating myself, that the approach of deep ecology is not moralistic, it's psychological. It is a process of identification with the rest of the world. And I think, touching on Robert's question about reappraising the notion of individuality, this whole background notion of non-local mind that is really gaining traction, that we are all receivers and transmitters within a sentient cosmos, is a huge paradigm shift at the very deepest level. But as I said at the end of that article, it's easy not to care for an inanimate cosmos. If the cosmos is sentient like us, how can we not care for it?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Denise, we're going to have to take your question and observation in a later session, I'm afraid. We can't take any more questions at the moment.
No, that's fine.
Just before you go, I'm just going to share my screen. Pari Center will be talking about what's coming up in their program this afternoon. I just want to highlight a couple of events for you rather than go through this whole thing. Just to say that here we are. Next week we've got Bruce Grayson talking about his new book After, and this is with the Institute of Genetic Sciences. And this is one I think here, Alex Evans will be of interest to people who are on this call. Politics Meets Psychology, an exploration of the places our inner and outer worlds collide. And he runs something called the Larger Us. So I think you'll find that very, very interesting. And then Rupert Sheldrake will be reporting on his the 40th anniversary
the new science of life. Again, this is with the Institute of Genetic Sciences. And I think there'll be of great interest here again in our event with Vandana Shiva. And you should watch this film if you haven't already watched it. Just go to Vandana Shiva, the movie. I'll put it in this afternoon. Regenerating Soil, Regenerating Health. And then the final thing I just want to point out here is that is the Galileo Commission, of which Andrew is a part. And this is really this fundamental shift in worldview towards a sort of non-local idea of mind. And so do go and have a look at this at galileocommission.org and either join up as a professional affiliate if you have an academic background or just as a friend. And we have another event coming up next month on that front as well. So that's just a brief mention of some of the things that we've got coming up. And so the score this afternoon, we're reconvening at 4 CET, 3 BST, and whatever time it is in your local area. So use the same link as this morning. And then we'll look forward to continuing our discussion about various $64,000 questions and what we can do about them and how we can be as well as act later in the day. So thank you, Colin. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you later. Have a good lunch and maybe a bit of a walk to get some fresh air before you sit down in front of another screen. Thanks so much. See you all later.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.